Dive into a chilling collection of short terrifying stories that will haunt your mind and keep you up at night. Are you brave enough to listen? Part 1, The First Night. JC had only been working at the hotel for 3 weeks. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and the hours suited him. The hotel itself was old, so old that it creaked and groaned like a living thing during the night. Located on the edge of town, surrounded by thick, shadowy woods, the place had a reputation of being a little off. But it wasn't JC's job to question the guests or the history of the building. He was just the night clerk, handling check-ins, making sure everything ran smoothly after the sun set. At first, he'd found comfort in the quiet solitude of the late-night shift. There was something calming about the empty hallways, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the sound of the distant wind rustling through the trees outside. But that first night shift had changed everything. The air felt different that night. Thicker. Colder. JC chalked it up to exhaustion. He had been working long hours, and the stress of keeping everything in order was beginning to get to him. The hotel was nearly empty. Only a few rooms had guests, all quiet, respectable people. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to worry about. It was around 3:15 a.m. when it happened. He had just finished a round of checks, making sure the lobby was clean and tidy, when he heard the first noise. A soft tapping. Not quite a knock, more like fingers against wood. It was coming from the hallway outside the front desk. JC stood up slowly, his heart thudding in his chest. The sound wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Sometimes, the old pipes or the settling wood could create odd noises in the night. Still, he had learned to trust his instincts in a place like this. He glanced at the security monitors. The hallway was empty. Another tap. Louder this time. He swallowed hard and stood motionless, listening. The sound was coming from room 102, the farthest room down the hall, a room that had been unoccupied for the last 3 days. JC didn't understand. The guest list was small, and none of them had requested anything after checking in. His thoughts raced as he moved cautiously to the hallway. The tap stopped as soon as he reached the door, but there was something in the air now, something heavy, something oppressive. He could feel it in his chest, as though the very walls of the building were watching him. JC didn't want to open the door. He didn't want to be the one to investigate. But duty called. With a deep breath, he reached out and turned the doorknob. The door creaked open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the pale glow of moonlight streaming in through the blinds. It was empty, no bags, no clothes, no signs of anyone having been there. Just an untouched, pristine room. He walked in, scanning the space, his eyes darting from corner to corner. Nothing out of the ordinary, but there it was again, the faint tapping sound, now coming from inside the room. It was like fingers lightly brushing against the wood of the wardrobe, the sound so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. JC stepped forward cautiously, his feet barely making a sound against the old carpet. He reached the wardrobe and opened it. Inside, there was nothing but a dark, empty space. Yet the sound, it was still there. The tapping. It was coming from the far corner of the room. A painting hung crookedly, its frame askew as if someone had pulled it slightly from the wall. The tapping noise seemed to emanate from behind it, faint but distinct. He stepped forward, slowly, nervously. His fingers brushed against the frame, and the sound stopped. For a brief moment, the room felt still. Calm. But just as JC let out a breath, thinking it had all been some weird trick of his imagination, he heard it again. The tapping. Only now, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from behind him. JC whipped around, but the room remained silent. Empty. His heart raced as he scanned the room once more, his pulse thundering in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone anymore. Something, someone, was in that room with him. He wasn't sure how he knew it, but it was as if the very air around him had thickened, pressing in on him, suffocating him. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. "Can I help you?" JC turned around so quickly he nearly tripped over his own feet. Behind him stood a woman, an older woman, her skin pale, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She was dressed in a simple nightgown, her hair disheveled, as though she had just woken up from a nightmare. I'm sorry," JC stammered. "I thought I heard something. Are you a guest here?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped forward, her face a mask of confusion. I think I'm lost," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "This isn't my room." JC's mind raced. This was room 102, no one had checked into it in days. He checked the records earlier that evening. So how? Before he could ask her any more questions, the woman turned away, her footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. "Wait!" JC called, but the woman didn't stop. The hallway seemed unnervingly long as he followed her out of the room, his breath shallow, his feet cold against the old, worn floor. When he reached the lobby, she had disappeared. There was no sign of her. Part 2, The Haunting Begins. The clock on the wall read 3:45 a.m. JC stood at the front desk, hands shaking as he scanned the guest list again, his mind racing with questions. The woman, who had she been? There was no record of anyone being assigned to room 102, let alone someone who looked so out of place. He had checked the room himself just a few moments ago, and it was empty. Completely empty. But the woman had been there, hadn't she? He wasn't imagining it. He had seen her, clear as day. And yet, when he searched the lobby, the hallways, and the surrounding rooms, there was no sign of her. JC rubbed his temples, trying to calm the growing panic inside him. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe he had just seen something he wasn't meant to see, a trick of the light or his own tired mind playing tricks on him. He had been up for nearly 12 hours straight. It wouldn't be the first time fatigue had messed with his perception. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. Something was wrong in the hotel. Something had always been wrong. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft chime, the sound of the elevator arriving. JC glanced up, expecting to see another late-night guest returning to their room. But there was no one there. The elevator doors creaked open, as if it had been forced to carry a heavy burden. There, in the dim light of the lobby, he could just make out the faintest silhouette, a shadowy figure standing inside the elevator, looking directly at him. For a moment, JC froze, unable to tear his eyes away. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the darkness. The only thing JC could make out were two glowing eyes, reflecting a cold, unnatural light, staring right into him. The elevator doors slowly began to close, the figure stepping back into the shadows. JC blinked, his heart racing. Had he seen that? Or was he just losing it? "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" No answer. The elevator continued its descent without a sound. JC moved toward the elevator cautiously, his legs feeling like lead. He reached the door and pushed the call button again, hoping that whoever, or whatever, had been inside would return. The doors slid open with a loud, mechanical groan. Empty. The elevator was empty. His pulse quickened. He looked down the hall, the flickering lights casting strange, long shadows on the walls. Was someone playing a prank on him? He was the only one on duty tonight, and he hadn't seen any other staff members come in. Suddenly, the quiet atmosphere was broken by the soft sound of footsteps from the stairs. JC turned, his breath catching in his throat. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the narrow hallway like the sound of someone dragging their feet. He took a step back. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't someone who belonged here. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. JC stood frozen, eyes wide, listening for any sign of movement. But there was nothing now. The silence was suffocating. And then, the tapping began again. Soft at first, like the distant sound of fingernails gently tapping on wood, but growing louder with each passing second. JC's heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to the guest list on the front desk. He had to check again, had to make sure there was no record of anyone checking into the hotel tonight. Maybe there was some mistake, some glitch in the system. But before he could open the log, the tapping came closer. It was right behind him now, just at the edge of his hearing. He froze, dread crawling up his spine. He didn't want to turn around. He didn't want to face whatever was behind him. But he had no choice. Slowly, he turned his head, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as he saw the figure standing in the hallway. It was a woman, just like the one from earlier, her features pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her hair tangled, hanging loosely around her face. She was standing perfectly still, staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. JC opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat had gone dry, his voice lost to the heavy, oppressive air that hung around her. He wanted to ask her who she was, what she wanted, but his legs wouldn't move. His body refused to obey him. The woman tilted her head to one side, her expression unreadable, and then, without warning, she started walking toward him. Each step was slow, deliberate. Her feet didn't even touch the ground, it was as if she glided across the floor. JC's breath caught in his throat. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop several degrees, and the air grew thick with a damp, stale odor, like something that had been trapped in the walls for decades. "Please," JC whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, stop." But the woman didn't stop. She kept coming, her eyes fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. Her hands were outstretched, her fingers twitching, as if she were about to reach out and touch him. JC stumbled backward, his back hitting the front desk. He slammed his hands down on the counter, knocking over a small stack of paperwork. The woman was only a few feet away now, her breath ragged, her lips parted as though she were gasping for air. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, she stopped. Her cold eyes locked onto his for one last, haunting moment before she turned and walked away. JC was paralyzed, unable to move as she retreated back into the dark hallway. The sound of her footsteps faded into nothingness. For what felt like an eternity, JC stood there, his body trembling, his mind racing with questions. Was it real? Was he losing his mind? He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But one thing was certain, something was wrong with this place. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Part 3, The Unseen Forces. The rest of the night passed in a blur for JC. He couldn't focus. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, sent his nerves into overdrive. He tried to tell himself that it was all in his head, a product of exhaustion and stress. But the woman's face, the way she had moved, the way she had stared at him, kept replaying in his mind, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The sun was just beginning to rise when the first guest of the morning, a business traveler with a coffee in hand, stepped through the front door. JC forced a smile and greeted him, though his eyes kept darting toward the hallway, half expecting the woman to appear again. "Everything all right, buddy?" the guest asked, noticing JC's tense expression. "You look like you've seen a ghost." JC didn't respond, just shook his head. The guest didn't press him further, but his concerned glance lingered. JC wished he could explain, but words failed him. He was too embarrassed to admit what had happened, or worse, to admit that he wasn't sure if any of it had really happened at all. The morning passed in a haze, and by noon, the hotel lobby was quiet again, almost eerily so. The usual hum of activity had faded, and the air in the building felt stifling. JC hadn't had the courage to check room 102 again, nor had he bothered to ask the housekeeping staff if anyone had been in or out. He just wanted to make it to the end of his shift without losing his sanity. As the clock ticked closer to 3 p.m., JC's exhaustion became unbearable. He hadn't gotten a proper rest in over 24 hours, and the creeping sense of dread from the night before still clung to him. He decided to step outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping the cool breeze would clear his head. The moment he stepped out the front door, the weight of the hotel seemed to lift slightly. The trees outside swayed gently, their leaves rustling in the wind. He took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air that seemed so much cleaner than the stagnant, oppressive atmosphere inside. He even began to relax, just a little. But that moment of peace was fleeting. From the corner of his eye, JC saw a shadow move across the hotel's entrance. He turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the quiet, empty parking lot. He exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the sensation that something was watching him. He glanced back at the hotel, its weathered exterior looked the same old bricks, the same cracked windows. But there was something wrong about it. He could feel it in his bones now. The building was alive, or at least something inside it was. Before he could think any more on it, he heard the door to the hotel creak open behind him. JC spun around. There, standing in the doorway, was the woman again. Her hair was wild, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her hands, clawed and trembling, hung limply by her sides. Her face was gaunt, her skin sickly pale, and she stared at him like she was seeing something beyond him. Something he couldn't comprehend. Her lips parted, and the words she spoke sent a chill down his spine. "You have to leave, before it gets worse." JC's stomach dropped. He didn't know if it was the way she looked, or the way she spoke, but he knew that this wasn't just a random guest. She wasn't just lost or confused. She was a warning. "Who are you?" JC asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The woman's gaze never wavered, her body slowly swaying as though caught in some invisible current. Then, in a voice that was not her own, she answered, "You're not supposed to be here. None of us are." Before JC could respond, she turned and vanished back into the hotel, her footsteps echoing loudly in the still air. But just as quickly as she disappeared, JC felt a deep, sudden dread. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't his imagination. Whatever was in the hotel, whatever had been haunting him, was real. He rushed back inside, but when he crossed the threshold, the air was thick again, the oppressive weight hanging over him. The hotel felt darker now, as though it had shifted somehow, and everything around him seemed off-kilter. The walls looked a little too close, the hallways a little too long. He looked around the lobby, expecting to see something, someone. But everything was silent. Just the low hum of the old lights above him and the faint rustle of paper from the desk. His eyes darted to the hallway, then to the elevator doors. No one was there. JC couldn't take it anymore. He needed answers. He grabbed the hotel register and started flipping through the pages. It was a long shot, but maybe there was something, some pattern, something that could explain the strange woman and the things happening in the hotel. He skimmed over names and dates, his finger tracing over the ink. And then, he found it. The name was written in the same shaky script as all the others, but it was the date that made his stomach twist, Room 102, March 4, 1982. The same room. He stopped for a moment, staring at the name, Elizabeth Blackwell. Something about it felt wrong. It felt familiar, like he had heard that name before. It took him a minute to place it, but when he did, his blood ran cold. Elizabeth Blackwell. The woman. The one who had warned him. He quickly turned to the next page, scanning it with shaky hands. The entries were ordinary at first, check-ins, check-outs, regular guests. But then, his eyes froze again. A strange entry stood out. It was written in a different hand, scribbled hastily in the margins, "Do not stay. They are here." JC's heart hammered in his chest. Was this some sort of cryptic warning from someone else who had seen the same things? Had Elizabeth left this note behind? The more he stared at it, the more the words seemed to blur, the more he felt like something was trying to make him look away. He had to know more. Part 4, The Past Never Leaves. The night after JC discovered the cryptic message, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elizabeth Blackwell's face, her hollow eyes locked onto him with an intensity that felt like a warning. It was as if her gaze was burned into his mind, pulling him towards something he couldn't fully understand. Something that was slowly crawling its way out from the depths of the hotel's history. He sat at the desk, his head pounding from lack of rest. He had tried to leave the hotel earlier in the day, just to get some space, some air. But every time he stepped outside, it felt like the hotel was waiting for him to return. It was as if it had already claimed him, like it was calling him back, beckoning him to uncover its darkest secrets. After a long, sleepless day, J.C. decided he had no choice. He had to investigate further. Something in the back of his mind told him that if he didn't find out what was happening, if he didn't understand the hotel's past, he would never escape. The hotel wasn't just haunted by spirits, it was haunted by its own twisted history. The sun had long since set, casting the lobby into darkness as J.C. sat in front of the register, the pages of guest records scattered around him. He had already gone through every page of the log, searching for any clue that could explain the events that had unfolded. But Elizabeth Blackwell's name kept coming up, again and again. Her check-in date had been marked on multiple pages, and there were mentions of her in the margins of the guest records, cryptic phrases that spoke of warnings, curses, and the curse of room 102. At first, J.C. thought it was just some bizarre coincidence, some strange set of entries made by a few paranoid guests. But the deeper he dug, the more the records seemed to be written to him. Like someone, or something, was trying to guide him. A sudden noise broke his concentration. A faint thump echoed from the hallway, followed by a dragging sound. J.C.'s breath caught in his throat. It was coming from the stairs again, just like the night before. He stood up slowly, a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. He had no choice but to investigate, to follow the sound wherever it led. Maybe this time he would find answers. With a deep breath, he stepped into the hallway, the sound of his footsteps drowned by the creaking floorboards beneath him. The hallway was dark, bathed in shadow, but he could still make out the vague outline of the staircase at the far end. The noise was louder now, dragging, like something heavy being moved against the floor. It wasn't just footsteps this time. It was something worse. As he walked closer to the stairs, the air around him grew colder. The temperature had dropped significantly, and his breath fogged in the air as he exhaled. The hallway felt wrong, the walls stretching out like they were closing in on him. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until J.C. could see the source. There, standing at the top of the stairs, was a figure. It was her again. Elizabeth Blackwell. Her nightgown was tattered, torn as though she had been wandering the halls for decades. Her hair was matted and tangled, and her eyes were wide and glassy, staring out into the void as if she could see something that wasn't there. But what made J.C.'s blood run cold was her mouth. Her lips were parted, but no sound came from her. Instead, it was as if the room itself had started to speak. A low, guttural whisper filled the air, like the hotel was breathing, exhaling something ancient and hungry. The walls seemed to vibrate as though they were alive, responding to the woman's presence. "You're here too," Elizabeth's voice rasped, not from her mouth, but from the very air around J.C. The words echoed in his head, a voice that felt like it had been buried inside the hotel for years, waiting to speak. "Leave," Elizabeth whispered again, but this time the sound came from behind him, from the other end of the hall. J.C. spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper continued, louder now, swirling around him in a disorienting, maddening chorus of voices. He pressed his hands against his ears, desperate to block them out. It was like the hotel was speaking to him, calling to him from every corner, urging him to stay. Suddenly, the air grew still again, and Elizabeth's figure stepped forward, her pale, emaciated form moving with an unnatural fluidity. She didn't make a sound, her bare feet gliding across the floor as though she were walking on air. The whispers ceased, but the oppressive weight of the hotel pressed in on him. "I didn't want to," she said, her voice now clear, like a soft, sad whisper. "I didn't want to die here." J.C.'s heart pounded in his chest. "What happened to you? Why are you here?" he gasped, his voice trembling. Her eyes fixed on him, and for a moment, it felt like she was truly seeing him for the first time. "You have to understand," she said softly, "this place, it never lets you leave." JC swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" She took another step toward him, and her shadow stretched unnaturally long, crawling along the walls like a living thing. "This place, it holds us. It takes us. We are, part of it now." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it felt like it was echoing in his bones, vibrating through his very soul. "You're here now. Just like I was." Before he could respond, the lights in the hallway flickered. The air around him turned suffocating, as if the very walls of the hotel were closing in on him. And then, in a flash, she was gone, vanishing into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the oppressive silence. JC stood there, heart racing, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Something inside him broke in that moment. He knew what he had to do now. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was a prison. A living, breathing thing, feeding off the souls of those who stayed there. It had been taking people for decades, trapping them in its walls, keeping them in its grasp for eternity. And now, it was trying to take him too. Part 5, The Unraveling. It felt as though the hotel itself was waiting for him to crack, like a predator circling its prey, patiently toying with him. JC had felt it from the moment he set foot in the place, but now it was undeniable. The oppressive, malevolent presence that lingered in every corner, behind every door, was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality. The things he had seen, the things he had heard, weren't just figments of his imagination. They were a warning. A warning that the hotel had claimed more than just the souls of the guests who'd passed through its doors, it had claimed them all. Elizabeth Blackwell, the woman who had spoken to him, was just one of many, he now realized. A victim. But not just any victim. She was trapped, like all the others, bound by the very essence of the hotel. Her words echoed in his mind, "It takes us. We are part of it now." JC had to find out more. He couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. The walls of the hotel seemed to whisper to him, promising answers but also warnings of horrors yet to come. There was no escape unless he uncovered the truth. He spent the next few days in a feverish haze, combing through every scrap of information he could find. The hotel's records were the most unsettling thing he had ever seen. The entries in the guest log, the cryptic notes in the margins, each one told a story of something far darker than any ordinary haunting. He learned that the hotel had been built in the early 1900s, but the land it stood on had a much older history, one that stretched back hundreds of years, to a time before the settlers had even arrived. The area had been used as a burial ground, a place of sacrifice. Native tribes had once called it a cursed land, and there were rumors of dark rituals performed by those who lived there before the hotel was constructed. The more JC dug, the more he found references to strange disappearances, guests who checked in, only to never be seen again. Some of them were registered under fake names, while others seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving nothing but a cryptic note or a strange marking in the guest book. But it was the history of Room 102 that sent chills down his spine. Every time someone stayed in that room, something terrible happened. The records were full of accounts of strange behavior, of people claiming to hear voices, see shadows in the corners of their eyes, or experience nightmares so vivid they couldn't distinguish them from reality. And then there were the more violent accounts, guests who had gone mad, who had committed unspeakable acts in their rooms, only to vanish shortly afterward, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and a growing sense of dread. JC's hands trembled as he looked through the pages of a particularly old logbook, its pages yellowed with age. One entry stood out, March 4, 1982, Elizabeth Blackwell, Room 102. Check-in complete. No further records. But it wasn't the date or the name that chilled him, it was the note scribbled underneath, "She never left." None of them do. JC's blood ran cold. The realization hit him like a wave. Elizabeth Blackwell hadn't been the first. She had been just one of many. And the hotel had claimed her soul, just as it had claimed the souls of every guest who had ever stayed in room 102. A voice whispered in his ear, soft and insistent, "You're next." JC froze, his heart racing. He spun around, but the lobby was empty. There was no one there. The voice had come from within him, or perhaps from the very walls themselves. The hotel was trying to break him. It had already begun. But there was no turning back now. He had to confront it. He had to face whatever evil was hidden in room 102 and put an end to it. With shaky hands, JC grabbed the old key to room 102 that he had found in the desk drawer. The key was cold, too cold, as if it had been waiting for him, anticipating his decision. He stood at the front desk for a moment, staring at the key in his palm, the weight of it heavy with the knowledge that this was the point of no return. He had to do it. Steeling himself, JC took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway. As he moved, the air grew heavier, colder. The walls seemed to close in on him, their old, creaking wood groaning under the weight of something ancient. The whispers started again, faint at first, like the distant sound of voices calling his name. JC. The hallway stretched out before him, the dim light from the old bulbs casting long, eerie shadows. The farther he walked, the more the temperature dropped. His breath fogged in the air. It was as though the building itself was reacting to his presence, reacting to his decision to confront whatever horrors lay in wait. When he reached room 102, he hesitated. The door seemed to pulse with energy, as if it were alive. The key felt heavier in his hand, and his fingers shook as he slid it into the lock. The door clicked open with a sound that was almost too loud in the suffocating silence. The room was exactly as it had been the first time he saw it, pristine, untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence that anyone had ever stayed there. The bed was made, the curtains drawn. But there was something wrong about it, something in the air that made it feel hollow. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. As soon as the door clicked shut behind him, the room seemed to change. The temperature dropped even further, and the faint smell of decay filled his nose, a staleness that made him want to gag. Then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, hidden behind a large wardrobe, was a symbol. It had been scratched into the wood of the floor, the edges worn smooth by time. It was a crude, circular shape, with strange markings etched around its perimeter. It looked almost like a seal, a ritualistic symbol, something dark and forbidden. JC's eyes widened. He recognized it from the research he had done. It was a sigil, a symbol of binding, a symbol used in occult rituals to trap souls. He stepped closer, his breath shallow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he crouched down to inspect the symbol. It was old, centuries old, but it was still potent, still alive. And then, without warning, a cold hand gripped his shoulder. Part 6, The Heart of Darkness. The grip on JC's shoulder tightened, cold fingers digging into his skin like icy claws. His blood ran cold, a primal fear flooding his veins as he froze, not daring to move. He could feel the weight of something sinister pressing down on him, an unseen force surrounding him. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the coldness of the hand, but the overwhelming sense of wrongness that seeped through his bones. Whatever it was, whoever it wasn't human. Slowly, he turned his head, barely daring to look over his shoulder. His eyes met nothing but empty air. The room was silent, the only sound the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He swung his head back to the corner of the room, where the symbol had been scratched into the floor. It was still there, still staring at him, as if it had been waiting for him to find it. The air around it seemed to shimmer faintly, as though something was stirring beneath the floorboards, as if something alive was trying to escape. The hand lifted from his shoulder, and the temperature in the room plummeted. JC shivered, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the symbol. Something was calling to him, something deep within the hotel's walls, urging him to understand the truth. To see what was hidden there. He stumbled back toward the bed, trying to steady himself, his legs weak from the terror surging through him. But his eyes kept flickering toward the symbol, unable to break its pull. The whispers started again. This time, they weren't just faint murmurs, they were voices, loud and distinct, chanting in unison. The words were unintelligible, a language JC couldn't comprehend, but the tone was clear, urgent, commanding, and relentless. JC. Come closer. JC. You must. He resisted the urge to follow the voices. The air felt thick, suffocating. It was like the walls themselves were pressing in on him. Sweat dripped down his back, and his hands shook as he fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape. But before he could reach it, the door slammed shut, the walls of the room vibrating with a force he could feel in his bones. A low growl filled the room, reverberating from all directions, like a distant storm gathering strength. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. JC's pulse raced. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it felt alive. It pressed against him, enveloping him, making the air feel thick with danger. He reached out blindly, his hands searching for the light switch, but there was nothing. No escape. The air seemed to hum with power, the room now vibrating under an invisible pressure. And then, from the darkness, a voice, this time, not in whispers, but a cold, guttural growl. You shouldn't have come here. JC's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, eyes straining to pierce the suffocating blackness, but saw nothing. Yet, he could feel it. Something, someone, was standing just inches from him. You are too late, the voice continued, its tone dripping with malice. The ritual is complete. A sudden burst of cold air hit him in the face, sharp as ice, and for a split second, the room flickered back into vision, a flash of blinding light illuminating the space before vanishing again. In that brief moment, JC saw it. A figure. The figure of Elizabeth Blackwell. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide with terror, her skin stretched taut over her skull, like a corpse that had been rotting for far too long. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, but no sound came from her. Her hands were raised, clawing at the air, as if she was trying to pull herself free from something that held her in place. The light flickered again, and she was gone, leaving behind only the oppressive darkness and the echo of that eerie, growling voice. You can't stop it now. JC stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The ritual, what ritual? Was this all part of some ancient curse? Was the hotel itself a vessel for something darker, something older? The growl turned into laughter, low and guttural, vibrating through the walls, as though the entire building was alive, mocking him. Then, suddenly, the darkness receded. The room was bathed in cold, sterile light again, and JC blinked in confusion. His head spun. His hands trembled as he looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The symbol on the floor, it was gone. The sigil was no longer there, the etching erased as though it had never existed. But he could still feel its presence. It was as if the room itself had absorbed it, like the hotel had taken the very essence of the curse into itself, pulling it deeper into its bones. It was too late. JC's heart sank. This place, this hotel, was no ordinary building, it was a prison, a vessel for something much darker. Whatever ancient evil had been trapped here for centuries was waking up. And it was hungry. He didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds. Minutes. Hours. All he knew was that the suffocating weight of the hotel was becoming unbearable. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the air thick with the tension of something ancient, something powerful and malevolent. And then he remembered. The guest log. The warning. The scribbled note that had haunted him since he found it, she never left. None of them do. JC understood now. The hotel wasn't just trapping souls, it was feeding on them. Every guest who had ever stayed here had been absorbed into its dark, twisted web. And now, it was coming for him. The door to room 102 slammed open. For a moment, everything stopped. The room was silent. No whispers, no growls. Just the eerie, suffocating silence. Then, a figure stepped into the room. It was Elizabeth again. But she wasn't the same. Her face was no longer twisted in fear. Her eyes were black, completely devoid of light. Her body was hunched, her limbs elongated unnaturally, as if the hotel had transformed her into something more, a vessel, a conduit for the darkness that had taken hold of this place. She stepped forward, her movements jerky, unnatural, and a voice, not her own, echoed in JC's mind. "You are mine now." Part 7, The Last Hour. Elizabeth's body, her twisted, contorted form, was no longer the fragile, desperate soul JC had seen just days ago. It had become something else, something dark and unnatural. Her limbs were too long, her movements too jerky, as though her body was struggling to hold on to its humanity. Her black eyes locked onto JC with a predatory hunger. "You are mine now," the voice echoed, but this time, it wasn't just the whispers. It was everywhere, in the very air around him, in the walls, the floors, the ceiling. It came from the hotel itself, the building alive with ancient hunger. JC's breath hitched as he took a step back, heart racing. The hotel had him now. He could feel it. The power pulsing through the air, closing in on him like a vice. The walls felt like they were breathing, in and out, slow and deliberate, as though the hotel was preparing to swallow him whole. He backed into the wall, the cold wood pressing against his spine. His hands trembled, but his mind was still sharp. He couldn't give up. He had to fight. He had to do something. But what could he do? What weapon could he use against something like this? Elizabeth's lips curled into a twisted smile, her black eyes gleaming with malice. She raised a hand, and the temperature in the room dropped so low that JC could see his breath misting in front of him. He shivered, but it wasn't from the cold, it was from the overwhelming dread that seeped into his bones. And then, her voice, no longer just in his mind but reverberating through the room, through the very air itself, filled his head like a drumbeat. "You're too late," she said, her voice slow, deliberate, satisfied. "The ritual has already begun. There's no escaping now. You belong to this place. Just like the others." JC's mind raced. He had to think. There had to be a way to stop it. He thought back to the research he had done, the guest logs, the old symbols. The sigil. The sigil that had been scratched into the floor. He had seen it. He had felt it. He knew it held the key to everything. Elizabeth took another step forward, her shadow stretching impossibly long across the room. The walls of the hotel seemed to bend and twist as if they were alive, warping with every step she took. JC could hear the sound of the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, but they sounded like they were coming from everywhere. All around him. The hotel was closing in. He had only moments. Suddenly, the voice in his head, Elizabeth's voice, was joined by others. Low, guttural whispers. Screams. Soft, distant cries. The trapped souls of those who had entered this place and never left. They had been absorbed, just like he was about to be. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Elizabeth growled, her voice splitting, the sound of multiple voices layered over one another. "You are part of the ritual. You are part of the hotel now." The walls began to shake, and the room seemed to bend, distorting like an image in a warped mirror. Shadows moved across the room, stretching like tendrils, reaching for him. JC's heart raced. This was it. He was at the heart of the darkness. The ritual had already begun, and the hotel was alive, feeding off the souls of those trapped here. But JC had one last card to play. With shaking hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the old key to room 102, the key he had found in the desk drawer when he first arrived. The key that had been with him through every terrible moment. He didn't know why he kept it. It had felt important. Now, he understood. This key, this object, was tied to the hotel's power. It was a conduit. A link. He had to use it. Elizabeth's eyes widened as JC raised the key high into the air, holding it in front of him like a weapon. The air around him crackled with energy, the shadows recoiling as if the key itself held some kind of power. JC focused all of his fear, his anger, his desperation into that moment. He had to break the connection between himself and the hotel, before it consumed him completely. In one swift motion, he slammed the key down into the symbol on the floor. The impact sent a shockwave of energy through the room, and the walls of the hotel screamed. The floor beneath him trembled as the hotel roared, the sound deafening, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. The darkness surged, twisting and contorting around him, and for a brief moment, JC could see it, the heart of the hotel. It was a monstrous, writhing mass, an ancient entity that had been feeding on the souls of the damned for centuries. It was everything he had feared, everything he had uncovered, and it was hungry. But the key, the final piece of the ritual, was working. The entity shrieked in fury as the darkness around JC began to unravel, the energy rippling outward like a shockwave, tearing at the very fabric of the hotel. The hotel itself groaned, its foundation shaking, as if it were being ripped apart from within. Elizabeth's twisted form screamed, her body stretching and warping as if being torn apart. Her eyes flashed with a mixture of rage and desperation as the power of the hotel began to slip through its fingers. She reached out toward JC, but her body disintegrated before she could touch him, turning into ash that scattered into the air. The entire building seemed to shudder, as though it was alive, as though it were dying. The air was thick with the scent of decay, but now, for the first time, there was something else, a crackling tension, like a storm breaking. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the room fell silent. The shadows receded, the air warmed, and the walls stopped shaking. The hotel felt still. Quiet. For the first time since JC had arrived, the oppressive weight that had been hanging over him lifted, and he could finally breathe again. JC collapsed to his knees, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. The floor beneath him was solid, the air no longer suffocating. The hotel was silent. The whispers had stopped. The voices of the lost souls were gone. He had done it. The ritual was broken. But at what cost? JC didn't know how long he stayed there, on the cold, hard floor of room 102, trying to catch his breath. His head was spinning, his body exhausted. His mind was still reeling from the horrors he had just witnessed. Eventually, he managed to stand, the key still heavy in his palm. He glanced around the room, half expecting something to leap out at him, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Silent. JC walked toward the door. He opened it slowly, unsure of what he would find on the other side. The hotel was quiet. Too quiet. The hallway was empty. The lobby was still. It felt like the entire building had been drained. The life had been sucked out of it. The doors were open, the streets outside beckoning, but JC wasn't sure if he was free yet. But one thing was certain. The hotel was no longer its own master. And neither was he. With a final glance back at the darkened doorway of room 102, JC stepped out into the night, leaving the hotel, and its horrors, behind. For now.